You're here to join us for this evening with Glenn Altschuler and President Fox, talking about the 2020 election. Before we get to that, I just want to make a few remarks about what the Graham Center is, and then share one personal anecdote, if you'll indulge me for just a moment. So the Bob Graham Center for Public Service is driven by three fundamental principles of civic engagement, public service, and public leadership, inspired by the career and life of former Governor and Senator Bob Graham and Mrs. Graham. We pursue those initiatives in a variety of ways. Most visibly right now, you might know us for our voter engagement initiatives, where we coordinate a lot of US efforts on voter registration and get out the vote efforts. Also, we do a lot of public programming, and this is one of those events centered on the election that we're working on this fall. Again, in a moment, I'll turn it over to President Fox to take over the run of show from there. But I want to share one personal anecdote. So I was actually an undergraduate at Cornell from 1989 to 1993. So I've just dated myself here. And Professor Altschuler was in the history department at Cornell when I was there. I was not fortunate enough to take a class with Professor Altschuler while I was there, but in a department where there were real titans in the history profession at that time. If you wanted to do colonial American history or early republic or constitutional, you had Mary Beth Norton. If you wanted to do antebellum America, you had Joel Silby. If you wanted to do American culture, you had Michael Kamen. But there were two historians who stood above all others when you wanted to talk about the impact of the past on our understanding of the present, in particular, when it came to politics. If they were interested in international affairs or connected to international affairs, it was Walt Lefevre, who I was fortunate to take classes with, and who is one of the two or three most renowned scholars of the history of US foreign relations. If it was domestic politics, it was Glenn Altschuler. And I was very fortunate to go to several public talks that he gave while I was an undergraduate at Cornell. And I remember walking out of one of them, and I think it was maybe 1992, and it was about the presidential election, not surprisingly. And I remember walking out of that and thinking to myself, I have no idea what I want to do when I'm older, but whatever I do, I hope I can do it half as good as that guy. And I just remember being so impressed by that particular moment and being engaged by this individual who was so passionate about what he was doing. And I'm delighted to see that that passion still remains, has not ebbed at all. And I'm excited that we can bring some of that to you this evening. So with that, I'll turn it over to President Fox for the rest of the evening.
Thank you, Dr. Jacobs. And many thanks to you and your team at the Graham Center for hosting this timely webinar. I just want to give a real shout out to the Graham Center for all the work that it's done with the scores of students and getting out the vote. We are in the top 10 nationally in the number of students that have registered to vote for this election. The early voting center polling station in the Rights Union has over 7,000 people that have voted so far. And it's just a real privilege to have the Graham Center be such an important part of our community and indeed our university. I want to give a real warm welcome to the students who are with us this evening, as well as the faculty, the staff, and the members of our community that are participating in this session. I'm going to have the privilege here in just a minute of introducing a great scholar and a great speaker, teacher, and writer, but most of all, a great friend of mine, Cornell University professor and noted author, Dr. Glenn Altschuler. This is actually the third time that he's spoken at the University of Florida over the past nearly 5 years, a little over 5 years. And he most recently spoke in the Graham Center in 2018, just before then, again, the midterm elections. I first met Glenn in 2002. I was the new Dean of Engineering at Cornell, and he was at that time the long-term Dean of Continuing Education at Cornell and summer sessions. Glenn served as dean for nearly 30 years, if you all can imagine that. And so he at Cornell, as you heard from Dr. Jacobs, is not only an amazing teacher, a great scholar, but an amazing leader in higher ed as well. We were quite different. I was an engineer, he was in humanities. I was an evangelical Christian. He grew up in a Jewish family. I grew up in a small town and before going to high school in Miami, but he grew up in Brooklyn. But we became fast friends. And more importantly, in some respects than just being mere friends, which was amazing for me and encouraging to me, but he was also my mentor. I knew that in 2009, when the Great Recession occurred, that I could go to Glenn and get advice about how to manage the budget of the university. I knew if there was a personal issue, that at 7 a.m. in the atrium of Duffield Hall, I could find Glenn Altschuler drinking his decaf coffee and eating the top half of a muffin. And so weekly, we would get together, we would have conversation, he would encourage me, and I would come away with advice and wisdom about how to deal with the week's challenges. So Dr. Altschuler is one of the most prolific authors that I know. He has more than 1,000 op-eds and book reviews. He's written and co-written 11 books that range from a book on rock and roll called All Shook Up, How Rock and Roll Changed America, a book on the GI Bill, the New Deal for Americans, for veterans, excuse me, a book that he spoke about here in one of his visits called The 10 Great American Trials. He also writes essays and reviews for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and many other publications, actually worldwide. Every 2 weeks, I get an email, and that email contains the book reviews, a link to them, and the op-eds that Glenn has written and Dr. Altschuler has written in the past 2 weeks. So yesterday morning at 7:23, I got one of those emails of the op-eds and book reviews that he'd written in the past 2 weeks. Let me just tell you about them. There are 3 op-eds, and as you might imagine, they're about politics, and there are 5 book reviews. The books are on university presidents, on Jimmy Carter, a biography of Jimmy Carter, a book on the new global far right, a book on the FBI and the CIA and the truth about America's deep state, and a book about prison politics. When you see Glenn at any point, you will find him holding a book. This is a life lesson for the students that are on this Zoom call. And the reason that he's holding that book is that he reads books. Since he was in school as a grad student, he has read every day of his life at least 100 pages out of a book. And coming out of that is what he teaches, what he writes about. I know he would say it's been life-changing for him, and it's something that all of us, I think, we may not achieve 100 pages a day every day of our life, but it is something that can benefit each one of us. When I had Glenn here, hosted him in 2018, at that time, the director of the Graham Center was Dr. David Colburn. We lost Dr. Colburn last year in 2019, just over a year ago. And he had been a director of the Graham Center. He had been provost of the university. He had been chair of the history department. He had been a faculty member for 50 years. One of the amazing leaders and faculty members on which our university has been built. Dr. Colburn came up to me after Glenn's talk, and he said, Kent, I know why you like Glenn so much. He's very special, isn't he? And I said, yes, David, Glenn is very special. And it's my privilege, you all, to share my special friend with you. And it's a real treat that you all have in store. Before I turn over the Zoom platform to you, I just have a request of every one of you, and that is that you be thinking of questions. And I'd like you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom control panel to post your questions. And I'll do my best after Glenn finishes his talk to read those questions, and we'll listen to Glenn's response. So it's now my privilege to turn over the Zoom platform to Dr. Glenn Altschuler. Glenn, welcome to the University of Florida.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much, Kent. And I will say that these introductions are deeply, deeply moving to me and to you, students and community members out there. First, thank you for taking some time out of a busy schedule to listen to me. I just want to say before I launch into a talk about the election that Kent and I have a friendship that is very special. And my wish for every one of you, especially the students at UF, is that when you graduate, you have an enduring friendship with one or more people that is as good or better as the one I have with President Fox. It's the kind of thing that is life affirming, and your education will be so much richer if that kind of relationship accompanies it. So with that, let me turn to a subject that is on all of our minds, American politics. This election has clearly galvanized many Americans across the political spectrum. And what I'm going to try to do this evening is to give you some context for the election, talk about some of the issues, talk about the state of play and polling, and then maybe I'll make some predictions or things to look for election night and perhaps the day or so after election night. First, the context. American politics is more partisan than it has been at any time since the Civil War. We have two political parties, of course, and the people who affiliate with those parties are dug in in ways that contribute, I think, to the divisions that we see in the country. And let me give you an example of how dug in Americans are. In 1958, Republicans and Democrats were asked, would you like your son or daughter to marry a member of the political party to which you're affiliated? And 25% of Republicans and 25% of Democrats said, yes, I would like that. The rest, 75%, were perfectly okay with a son or daughter having a spouse of the other political party. When that question is asked now, about 70% say, I want my son or daughter to marry someone of the political party to which I belong. That's a higher percentage than when asked, should it be somebody of the same religion, somebody of the same ethnicity, somebody of the same race? It's probably the answer that is higher than any other category. Now, affiliation with political party in the United States is a little bit misleading. About a third of Americans register as Democrats, about a third as Republicans, about a third as independents. Most independents, however, are not independents. They vote consistently for one party or another. And we probably in this country have maybe about 10% of the population who are actually independents. And you might be interested to know that independents are the least informed about American politics of all American voters. They're not carefully weighing the alternatives and thinking, well, I like this person's position on the Second Amendment, but I'm a climate change person. They're not doing that. In fact, most Americans, and this is one of the great paradoxes of American politics, Americans now are intensely partisan, but Americans are not that interested in politics. They can't stand politicians, and they're strongly anti-establishment. Those two things exist together in our political system. You should also know that because of the two-party system that we have, most presidential elections in the United States are very close. We don't really have landslides. In the depths of the Depression, when 25% of Americans were unemployed and Herbert Hoover was running for re-election, he still got almost 40% of the vote. You can assume that candidates for either party will get 40% of the vote. So a substantial win in an election is a win of 7, 8, 9 points. A 54-46 is a very substantial win. As you know, not only does a candidate have to win the popular vote, but a candidate has to win the Electoral College. Donald Trump lost the popular vote by about 2.1% to Hillary Clinton in 2016, but he got 306 electoral votes and he was elected. He's now running for re-election, and he's finding a very challenging environment in which to run. President Trump assumed, planned, expected that he would ride to a fairly easy victory on a very robust economy. The economy of the United States during his first 3 years was quite good. Maybe not as good as he says it was, but quite good. Unemployment was at historic lows, less than 4% unemployment. The GDP was 3% or so, pretty good. There were some increases in the manufacturing sector, as he had promised in his campaign. Minority unemployment was significantly down. Well, running on the economy became a lot more difficult when the pandemic took the economy into the tank. And as all of you know, initially about 22 million people or more were out of work. We now have perhaps 10 million people unemployed, but that's still an unemployment rate of 8% or so. Very, very difficult to run on a robust economy in that environment. And in all likelihood, the economy would be even in worse shape if not for the stimulus packages propping it up a bit. So President Trump, who had an approval rating on the economy of about 56 or 57% at one time, now has seen a bit of a decline in Americans who approve of his handling of the economy. The important point about that is it's not the issue that he hoped it would be. It's also not the issue that he hoped it would be because of COVID. And COVID is the overwhelming issue on the minds of Americans. And Americans give President Trump very, very low marks for his handling of the coronavirus. Americans do not trust what the president says about the coronavirus. And there are very substantial numbers who do not trust him. In some instances, 60 or 70% of Americans express dissatisfaction with one or other of his approaches to the coronavirus. And the president, I think it's fair to say, has really not known how he should handle the coronavirus. And so he's now been handling it for quite some time by saying it's going to go away. For President Trump, his timing in saying that couldn't be worse. We've had a super spreader event at the White House. President Trump himself has contracted the coronavirus. The entourage of Vice President Pence has contracted the coronavirus. And just this week, we have highs in the number of cases around the country. They're spiking. Hospitalizations are up in 40 or more states in the United States, and some battleground states have very high hospitalizations. And he hasn't been able to get out from under. I think it's fair to say that President Trump, when the economy couldn't be the issue for him to run on, decided that he would emphasize law and order. And that, at times in American politics, has been a very promising issue for a politician. And it looked like it might be in the summer when we had massive protests, some instances of property damage, violence in the summer. And President Trump essentially said, this country needs a law and order president. That issue, whatever power it had in the summer, has receded in the fall. Now, we do have some protests and some violence in Philadelphia the last couple of days following the shooting of a mentally ill African American. And the president, I think, has raised that issue. It may be a little late in the game for that to have much impact on the election as a whole. So those are the three issues. For Joe Biden, the former vice president, there's essentially one issue. Joe Biden is running as what I would call the wounded healer. Wounded in the sense that he, when he was newly married, had a young wife and child killed in an accident. Wounded because his son, Beau Biden, very promising up-and-coming politician, military veteran, died of brain cancer a couple of years ago. A healer in a number of respects, principally around the coronavirus, listening to science, mask wearing, and a healer in emphasizing an issue that was very much emphasized by Democrats in the 2018 midterm elections and that paved their way to victory, and that is health insurance for Americans. The Affordable Care Act was not a popular piece of legislation when it was first passed, when Obama was president and Joe Biden was vice president. But it's pretty popular now. And Biden shrewdly emphasizes that it protects people with prior conditions from losing their insurance. So Biden has run a low-key campaign. He is in any other environment, I think he would be a pretty weak candidate. He's not a great speaker. He's not young. He's not charismatic in any way. But this running as a man of integrity, a low-key person to take down the temperature in the country, and he's running not only as a healer in healthcare, but a healer of the divisions in the country. It is a moment that he seems to fit reasonably well. So I think for all of those reasons, it's not all that surprising that we're now 6 days before Election Day. Over 70 million people have already voted. And Vice President Biden at the moment has in American political terms, a fairly sizable lead in the national polls, maybe 8%, perhaps even 9% in the national polls. Now, let me just take a moment and talk about polls. Polls got a bad rap in 2016. They really were not as bad as you might think, for this reason. The race was very close until the end of September. On October 5th, 2016, the Access Hollywood tapes in which Donald Trump was heard making unacceptable remarks about women were released. Hillary Clinton got a sugar high, and she went from being 3.5 points up in the election to being as much as 6.5 points in the next 3 weeks. That sugar high began to come down, and it came down with a thud because on October 29th, FBI Director Comey said he was reopening the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, and she went from a 6% lead in the last 2 weeks of the election to a 3% lead. And on election day, the pollsters said she would win the election by 3.5%. She won it by about 2.5%. That's pretty good in terms of polling. The state polling in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, the key states that Trump carried, the state polling was off, but it was off for a reason. When she was way up in October, the good pollsters stopped polling. They thought she would win in a walk. They didn't know that those 3 states might be competitive. This time, I assure you, the pollsters are not going to ignore Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, or any of the other key states that are in play. And let me say something else, another statistic. Political junkies like me love statistics. Since 1972, the advent of polling, only 2 presidential races have seen a fluctuation in the national polls of more than 2.5% in the last 2 weeks of the election. It's a myth that polls shift dramatically right at the very end. And in this election, it's rather unlikely that that will be the case, not only because so many people have voted already, but because in 2016, 6% of Americans voted for third-party candidates. In 2020, it'll be 3% or less. And we've had an even intensification of partisan polarization. So the likelihood of a big shift between now and election day is pretty small. So let me move now quickly. Kent was so eloquent about me, brought tears to my eyes, but he cut into my time. You know, he really did. So I got to move quickly. What to look for the election? First, I want to say something. Florida is incredibly important to this election. And it's also very important to me personally, not only because Kent is a Floridian and I love Kent, and so I have a kind of association with the state of Florida, but for this reason. Those of you who are looking at me realize that I'm an old guy. I'm 70 years old. I've been at Cornell for 50 years, and I'm well known for wanting to be in his pajamas with the little feet in them by about 9 o'clock at night. I also want to watch the election returns. And so what I am looking forward to is an early call by the state of Florida by 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And it's quite possible because Florida is very good at counting millions of mail-in ballots. They process them as they come in, they count them, and we can have a result if the race is not razor thin. If the race is called for Vice President Biden, I'm going to go to sleep. And I'm going to go to sleep because Donald Trump cannot win this election without carrying Florida. If the race is called for President Trump, then all eyes are going to be on Pennsylvania because Joe Biden can lose Florida, but if he wins Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the states that put Trump over the top in 2016, Biden will win the election anyway. Now, if Florida is the fastest state to report, Pennsylvania is going to be the slowest state to report. Pennsylvania doesn't allow election officials even to open mail-in ballots, to identify signatures, to begin processing them until election day itself. So it'll be at least 2 or 3 days before Pennsylvania's votes are in. I think it's quite likely that former Vice President Biden will carry Michigan. I think it's quite likely he will carry Wisconsin. Of those 3 states, the closest is Pennsylvania. As we speak tonight, Biden is ahead by 5 points in state polling in Pennsylvania. That's a sizable lead. It's a lead that probably will be enough to carry him over. But there are some reasons to be concerned if you're a Biden supporter, and to take heart if you're a Trump supporter. Another one of these political junkie statistics. In 2016, of the people who were registered to vote and did not vote, 63% in Pennsylvania were whites without a college education, the base of Donald Trump. That means there are a lot of people who are potential Trump supporters in Pennsylvania who didn't vote last time, who Team Trump believes might be inclined to vote for Trump this time. So Pennsylvania is going to be a little bit of a stay tuned place. Now, there are some other states in play. Arizona is one. And if Biden loses Pennsylvania and carries Arizona or North Carolina or Georgia, he can win the election even without Pennsylvania. So there's a chance that we'll know a lot when Florida comes in. There's a chance, and I can go to bed with my little PJs on. There's a chance that we'll have to wait days for Pennsylvania. At the moment, I think it's considerably more likely that Biden will win by a more than a squeaker in the election, and if he does that, it will be more difficult for President Trump to contest the election. A very, very quick run through of the United States Senate races. There are 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats in the Senate. If former Vice President Biden becomes president and Kamala Harris can break ties, the Democrats need a net pickup of 3. If President Trump wins, they need a net pickup of 4. They're going to lose a seat in Alabama. Doug Jones has no chance of winning. Alabama is a deeply red state. And I think I can say this to UF fans. It's a bad idea, whether you're in Alabama or Florida, to run against a football coach. And Doug Jones, the Democrat, is running against Tommy Tuberville, a former Alabama football coach. So Doug Jones is going to lose. That means the Democrats need a pickup of either 4 seats or 5 seats. 4 seats if Biden wins. They're going to pick up 2 seats almost certainly. One in Colorado, and Colorado has a similar situation to Alabama. If you're running in a state like Colorado, it helps to be an astronaut or a former astronaut. And Mark Kelly's a former astronaut. He's going to win, not Colorado, Arizona. He's going to win the race in Arizona. Former Governor Hickenlooper is going to win the race in Colorado. That's a net 2 pickups. Then we look at very close races for the 2 additional pickups. Maine, Susan Collins caught between a rock and a hard place. She tried to distance herself from President Trump, but on the other hand, she needs Trump supporters to win. She's running about 3 or 4 points behind in Maine. Biden's going to carry Maine by a lot. She's probably going to lose. That's 3 pickups. Joni Ernst in Iowa is the incumbent, and she's running. She's in a very, very tough race, and she made a big mistake a couple of weeks ago in her debate. The moderator asked a question of Teresa Greenfield, the Democrat, and one of Joni Ernst in Iowa, a farm state. He asked Teresa Greenfield, what's the price of soybeans? And he asked Joni Ernst, what's the price of corn? Both Ernst and Greenfield grew up on farms. Greenfield answered the question correctly to the penny. Joni Ernst clearly had no clue. She filibustered and talked and talked and talked. And then the moderator said, Senator, I asked you the price of corn, and she couldn't do it. That may be enough to lose it for her. And then the final possible pickup, or a final, there are a couple of other ones which I can talk about maybe in the Q&A, is in North Carolina. It looked like an almost certain pickup for the Democrat, Cal Cunningham against the incumbent Tom Tillis, until text messages from Cal Cunningham to a woman who clearly is his mistress were discovered. Cunningham was running as a family man. This didn't help in a very conservative state, but much to my surprise, he is still holding on to a lead in North Carolina, and I think it's quite possible that he will win. So I think it's more likely than not that the Democrats will take control of the Senate, but it's not more likely by a lot that they will do so. Let me just conclude, because I really want to have time for Q&A. That's the most fun part of things. I want to begin by congratulating all of you who are listening, watching. You're clearly engaged with politics. It looks like it may well be that this year, for the first time in a presidential election, young people will come out in force and vote. And what I will say to you again as a 70-year-old guy is, we need you. We need you to be engaged. We have not done well by you. Our generation has not done well by you. And now you need to do well by you. And the way to start is to be informed about politics, to be active in politics, not only to vote, but to be engaged and involved in issues that you care about. And no matter what your politics, if we want to make America great, or to make America great again, you will have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. And from what I can see, you're off to a great start. One of the greatest joys of being a professor is that we are always surrounded by young people. And that, for me, has been one of the most stimulating and rewarding experiences of my life. Many of my students are like members of my family. And so I began by saying that make a friend. I will end not only by saying get involved in politics, but do not leave this campus until you forge a relationship with a faculty member that lasts beyond your graduation and perhaps for decades and decades to come. So thank you all for listening and watching, and I'm going to try to field some questions.
Thank you so much, Glenn. So I'll read as many of these questions as I can. I'll start with a question about Vice President Biden and his son Hunter. Issues have been raised about their involvement with China. Do you believe that will affect the election?
I do not believe it will affect the election. And to date, we have allegations. We don't have evidence. And in fact, a Senate committee concluded its deliberations, and this was a Republican-controlled Senate committee, and they did not come up with credible allegations. So Mr. Giuliani, the president's counsel, took the issue to the New York Post, and I'm a New Yorker, so and I can say this. If the only newspaper you can get to cover a controversy is the New York Post, it's probably not one that you want to pay a lot of attention to.
The next question is about the integrity of mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, and lots been raised about issues with the integrity of them. Do you see that as being a factor in the election?
Well, history tells us that mail-in votes are extraordinarily safe and not subject to fraud. And it's very important to remember that many states in the United States have had all mail-in ballots for years and years and years and years, with 0.0001 instances of fraud. Your state, Florida, has had mail-in ballots for years and years and years with no evidence of fraud. And look, fraud is always possible, but I think safeguards have been in place for a long time, and we don't have evidence that that is a danger. It's not so easy to fix an election. Maybe you can change one vote by fishing it out of a mailbox, but doing this on a large scale is very, very difficult.
Next question has to do with polling. Is it correct that more supporters of Trump are unwilling to tell pollsters that they're supporting Trump and voting for him than Biden? In other words, are the polls skewed to Biden because the Trump supporters aren't telling the pollsters their views?
Trump supporters are prouder of their support for Donald Trump than Biden supporters are. And if you take a look at 2016, there was no evidence really of a hidden or silent or reticent Trump vote out there. Now, what is true, Kent, and I do want to say this, is that pollsters did not sufficiently account for the percentage of whites without a college education who would turn out in 2016. And what pollsters have tried to do is to change so that they are more accurately represented in the polls. So if there's a hidden vote, it's not so much because people don't want to tell a pollster that they're for Donald Trump or Joe Biden or anybody else. It's because the polls weren't weighting people with the kind of demographic background of Trump voters. And I think they have all tried to account for that. Now, it's still possible that one demographic group will surprise voters. Let me give you one on the other side of the scale. If many, many, many young people vote in this election, then the polls will undercount the support for Biden in the election, because they assume that young voters vote in the smallest proportions. When there are polling errors, it's the allocation of groups to likely voters that they either get right or they get off by a little bit.
So the next question is about universities and the two candidates. Have either of, and I'm adding a little bit to this question, have either of the candidates revealed what their policy is going forward, or said which will be more supportive of higher ed?
Well, they have very different views of higher ed, and I think that the Democratic Party has been more sympathetic to federal loans for college students, and even in some instances for subsidies for tuition. President Trump and the Republicans have been concerned, I think legitimately so in some instances, with the tilt of university faculty to the left, and would like to find ways to do that. And the Trump administration, in consonance with that, has been concerned about the denial of free speech, what President Trump and Betsy DeVos, Secretary of Education, believe is a denial of free speech opportunities to conservatives to come on campuses.
Next one's about the Supreme Court. And I'm going to put two questions together. Do you believe the Supreme Court will influence the outcome of the presidential election, either through decisions they've made, for example, in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin recently, or even the nomination and appointment of Amy Coney Barrett. Will the Supreme Court play a role in the elections?
Well, one of the things I frequently say is, I tell people I'm an historian, there's no future in it. So my ability to predict is probably no greater than anybody else's ability to predict. Today, the Supreme Court declined to intervene in Pennsylvania's extension of ballots for a few days, which is a kind of interesting development. And Amy Coney Barrett did not participate in that decision to deny. I think that it's difficult for the Supreme Court to get involved in these issues. It's not to say it's impossible, because we know from 2000 that they were involved, but it's this responsibility of the states to set the procedures for elections and to carry them through. And so it's not going to be that easy to bring cases to the Supreme Court. What I would say, Kent, is that that if the election is close, kind of razor thin, and we're talking about a few thousand ballots, then I think we'll have court challenges of all kinds. If you're losing by hundreds of thousands of votes, the challenges are going to be more difficult to mount, it seems to me.
So there are two questions about where can you go to get unbiased information? You mentioned statistics. Where do you get your information, those statistics? And then secondly, just general education that's not, as said in this question, merely the mouthpiece of one party or another.
Well, the most unbiased information you can get is just by getting in touch with me, since I'm entirely unbiased, as you could see in the presentation. Let me tell you what I try to do. I try to read a variety of sources that differ from one another. So that means the Wall Street Journal, a conservative publication, the New York Times. I read The Economist, which is a kind of middle of the road a publication. And then for the election, I would urge every one of you, Google Nate Silver 538. Nate Silver is a poll aggregator. That means you shouldn't pay attention to a single poll, but he does a poll of polls. And it's done with metrics that he doesn't try to hide. And that will give you a sense of the state of play in the election. Because I'm a political junkie, I probably check out 538 latest polls about 30 times a day. I don't do anything else during this time. I take breaks for meals, and then I go back to 538 and see if another poll came in.
Now, here's a very specific question, and I know nothing about this race. Do you have any insight into the Senate race in the state of South Carolina?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
It's Jamie
Have you ever been to
Harrison.
South Carolina? You ever been to South Carolina?
I've never been, other than visiting you, I've never been south of Brooklyn. Jamie Harrison, a very charismatic African-American, is giving Lindsey Graham the race of his life in South Carolina. Lindsey Graham has cruised to victory every single time. Jamie Harrison has raised a ton of money. And in fact, there are ads in New York, Kent, in Ithaca. There are Jamie Harrison TV ads in which he's raising money. It's kind of amazing. And he's raised more money than any Senate candidate, I think, ever. He's giving Lindsey Graham a very close race. If I had to predict, I will say that Lindsey Graham will hang on. And he'll hang on, he'll win narrowly, more narrowly than he's ever won before, because South Carolina remains a pretty red state. And so I should have mentioned with partisanship, with people so partisan, there's very little ticket splitting these days. If you're a Republican, you just pull down the lever for all the Republicans, and that may get Lindsey Graham through. And Lindsey Graham was also helped because he was the chair of the Judiciary Committee who shepherded through the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, even though he had promised when he blocked and the Republicans blocked Obama from having a candidate, he promised he wouldn't do it in 2020. And so he's gotten a lot of flack from Jamie Harrison on that issue, but I think he'll probably win.
Okay, we're going to do two more questions, and there are a bunch more here. This one is quite different. It's about simply if you have family members or friends who just don't believe that elected officials make a difference, and they can't see any difference between any officials, what do you say to them?
I would use physical violence. Beat them up and drag them to the polls. Now, if that fails, or you prefer not to do that, I think there are extraordinary historical parallels to cite. We have had substantial change in this country, not perfect. Politics involves compromise. There's no question about it. Does it make a difference? There's no doubt that it makes a difference. And if you want to persuade them, do your homework. Talk about how much, for example, Ronald Reagan made a difference in setting a conservative agenda when he became president. Talk about the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation that was advanced because Lyndon Johnson was president. Talk about winning World War II because Franklin Roosevelt steered the country well during World War II. We're now in a crisis or multiple crises, and elections matter in those crises.
So Glenn, our last question is simply about those students that are on this call that someday may run for office. And I meet so many elected officials in Tallahassee, Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate that were undergrads at the University of Florida. What advice do you give to those that may someday actually hold office, either as governor in the House, Senate, or maybe in Washington, D.C.? Do you have any advice for those?
Well, I'm going to maybe answer this in an unusual way. And I'm going to talk about you, Kent. Kent Fox has risen to a position of great esteem as president of the University of Florida. And he's done so while preserving his integrity. He's a person with as much or more integrity as any person I've ever met in my life. And if you aspire to be a politician, remember that you must never give your integrity away. That doesn't mean you don't compromise, but you must never give your integrity away. You must be well informed, and you must remember that what you're doing is public service. It's not to aggrandize you. It's to help other people and find ways, small and large, to keep in touch with other people. Find ways, small and large, to talk to constituents who agree with you or don't agree with you, and master the information. Information matters. Knowledge matters. And if you do all those things, you'll have a great career.
Thank you. That's an amazing way to end. So all of you that are a part of this this webinar, I know you've enjoyed it. I know you've learned something. And in addition to being an incredible speaker and everything else that we've said about Dr. Altschuler, I hope you've also got a sense of his humor, which is, he's one of the funniest people I know. So for all of you that are younger than Dr. Altschuler and I, we're, you know, he in Ithaca, New York, he's gonna put on his PJs with his feet. I'm gonna put on my PJs without any feet, and we're gonna go to bed here after a while. So Glenn, thank you so much. You're amazing as always.
Kent, it's great to see you, and I hope I'll see you in person before long.
Yes, and we'll share a eggplant pizza, which
We
is
will.
what we do when we get together.
Absolutely.
Okay. Take care. Thank you, Glenn. Thank you,
Thank you,
everyone.
Kent. Thank you, everybody, for setting this up, and thank you for coming.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.